Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling a really important topic, but it's also a pretty heavy one. We're going to be talking about domestic violence and femicide in Brazil. We're looking at a podcast called Breaking the Silence for this deep dive, and I gotta say, some of the stuff they found is really, well, it's eye-opening. One of the things they talk about right away is that in just 1 year, Brazil saw an 8% increase in femicide cases. That's thousands of women.
Yeah, and you know what really struck me listening to this podcast was how they weren't afraid to get into how complicated all of this is. They use this term love gone wrong, but then right away, they start to show how it's actually a lot darker than that.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about this love gone wrong idea. I mean, doesn't that seem kind of like an oversimplification?
It does, but think about it this way. Femicide is different than just any other murder. It's when a woman is killed specifically because she's a woman. And what makes it even more disturbing is that a lot of times it's the victim's partner or ex-partner who's doing the killing.
Oh, wow. So, like, woven into the violence is this betrayal.
Exactly. And the podcast actually tells this story about this woman, Maria, who was murdered by her husband after she told him she wanted a divorce. He just couldn't handle her being with someone else, so he killed her. I mean, it really makes you think about how jealousy and possessiveness can become deadly.
That's awful. And it makes you think that this love gone wrong thing is really more about control, isn't it? Like power.
Absolutely. The podcast talks about toxic love to describe it, where love basically becomes like a weapon, a way for someone to have control over another person. And that connects right back to that statistic we talked about, the thousands of domestic violence cases in Brazil. The podcast is saying that this toxic love is what's causing so many of those cases.
So Breaking the Silence asks this question. What drives someone to this point? Like, what would actually make someone go from loving someone to being violent or even killing them?
That is the question, right? And this podcast looks at it from a bunch of different angles. One thing they point to is how traditional gender roles are in Brazilian society.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? Like, how do gender roles fit into this?
Well, imagine living in a society where men grow up feeling like they're entitled to everything, and women are taught that they have to be submissive. You can see how that kind of power imbalance would make it easy for abuse to happen. Then on top of that, a lot of women in Brazil depend on their partners financially. So it makes it even harder for them to leave a relationship if it's abusive.
So they're trapped, is what you're saying. Trapped by the expectations of society. They're trapped financially, too.
Exactly. And even worse, the legal system in Brazil. It's getting better, but it still doesn't do enough to protect victims. The podcast has stories from women who went to the police about the abuse.
Yes.
And they were just told to go back to their husbands and try to work it out.
Wow, it sounds like the system's failing these women in so many ways. But even with all of that, even with those societal factors, doesn't it still come down to the person who's being abusive? Like, isn't it ultimately their choice?
Oh, definitely. We have to remember that while society contributes to all of this, the main issue is often that the abuser needs to have control and be dominant. That's at the core of this order.
Man, it's tough to hear about how the system fails these women, but does Breaking the Silence offer any hope at all? What do they tell women who might be in these dangerous situations to actually help them?
Yeah, definitely. Like, even with all the bad stuff, this podcast really shifts to focus on empowering women. They say straight up that there is help out there. The victims aren't alone. And they say it's super important to see the red flags early on.
Okay, so what are some of those red flags? Like, what should we be watching out for?
Well, one thing they talk about is isolation. Like when your partner tries to separate you from your friends and family. Another one is constant monitoring. Like checking your phone all the time or always wanting to know where you are. Oh, and they talk about emotional manipulation too. Like when someone puts you down all the time or makes you feel bad. Those are all signs of an abusive relationship.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening right now and they're like, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. What's the first thing they should do?
The podcast says it's really important to get support. Having people you can rely on can be so important in these situations.
So like friends and family, maybe a therapist too.
Exactly. Those connections are really important. But the podcast also talks about organizations and hotlines that are specifically there to help people in these situations.
So if someone's in immediate danger, there's somewhere they can turn to.
Yeah, for sure. These organizations can do all sorts of things, like counseling, legal help, even help finding a safe place to stay. And they talk about safety planning, which the podcast says is super important.
What exactly is safety planning, though?
So it's like having a plan if you have to leave quickly. You might have a bag packed with the essentials, knowing who to call in an emergency, having important documents and some cash, easy to grab, just stuff that you need if something happens. They even say you should have a code word you could use with people you trust if you need help.
Wow, I never thought about that. But that's actually a really good idea. It's like giving yourself the power back.
That's exactly it. It's about giving victims the information they need to make good choices and stay safe. But the podcast doesn't stop there. They go even further and talk about the need for big societal changes, starting with education.
So they're not just focused on helping people who are already in these situations. They want to stop it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. They say that education is the key to changing those cultural norms that make violence against women more likely.
What kind of education are we talking about here?
Think of it like preventing the problem before it starts, teaching young people about what a healthy relationship looks like, about consent and respect. Those are the things we need if we want a society where this kind of violence isn't tolerated. And this needs to happen everywhere.
So in schools, families, communities, everywhere.
Yes, exactly. Imagine schools teaching kids about healthy communication and resolving conflicts, and how important equality is in a relationship, and families talking openly about consent and respect, and communities stepping in when they see someone being abused or harassed.
That sounds amazing. But even with all that education, don't we still need laws to protect people and punish people who do this?
Absolutely. The podcast is very clear that education is only part of the solution. We need stronger laws that are enforced better, and a justice system that actually supports victims. That sends a message that this kind of violence won't be accepted.
Man, this has been a lot. I mean, we've talked about some really heavy stuff, like how bad femicide is in Brazil and how the system just isn't doing enough. But at least breaking the silence gave us some ideas about how to make things better, like education, stronger laws, and supporting the victims. There's just so much to think about.
I know, right? And I think the podcast does a great job of showing how everything's connected, like how what individuals do can actually lead to big changes in society.
So for someone listening right now, what's the most important thing for them to take away from all this? What can they actually do to help?
Well, I think the first thing is just to be aware. Really understand how big this problem is. Learn to recognize those warning signs of abuse. And remember that there are people and places that can help.
Yeah, being aware is definitely the first step. But then how do we actually turn that awareness into action?
There are tons of things you can do. You could volunteer at a shelter for domestic violence victims, or donate to organizations that help, or even just learn more about healthy relationships and consent and teach others.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't always realize how powerful just talking about these things can be. It helps to get rid of the stigma and makes people feel more comfortable asking for help.
Exactly. It's like we're changing the whole culture one conversation at a time.
And don't forget that even small things can make a difference. Like if you see someone being harassed, say something. Or if you hear someone making a joke about domestic violence, call them out on it. It's all about creating a world where that kind of behavior isn't okay.
Right. And one thing that breaking the silence really makes clear is that this isn't just a problem in Brazil. This is happening everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we all need to be talking about no matter where we live.
For sure. Violence against women is a human rights issue. It doesn't matter what country you're in. It's up to all of us to fight against it, to demand justice and create a world where women can be safe.
That's a really powerful message. So to everyone listening, I hope you'll really think about what you've heard today and consider what you can do to help make that safer world a reality. And that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.